There are two kinds of cold in the Colorado Rockies, and every soul who has spent a winter at elevation learns to tell them apart before their second season, or they do not survive to see a third. The first kind bites. It arrives with the clarity of a blade drawn clean from its sheath, sharp, honest, immediate. On a November morning when the sky is the particular blue that only exists above 8,000 feet, and the snow on the peaks catches the early light like crushed glass, that cold fills the lungs like a draft of something medicinal. It makes the blood move faster. It announces the world as a real and living place and places the person standing in it equally among the real and living things. Ranchers who have worked these mountains their whole lives will step outside into that cold pool, a long breath, and nod at it like an old acquaintance who keeps to the agreed terms of a long-standing contract. That cold can be respected. It can even be appreciated in the way that a difficult truth delivered cleanly can be appreciated. The second kind does not bite. It does not arrive. It accumulates. It begins as a slight heaviness in the air of a room, a quality of stillness that settles into corners and against baseboards in the hours before dawn. Then it is in the walls, not passing through them the way a draft passes, residing in them, in the grain of the timber, in the packed earth, between the logs and the dry grass stuffed into the gaps where the chinking has crumbled away. Then it is in the floor, rising through the soles of the feet, even through wool socks, even through the braided rag rug that covers the centerboards. Then if a person has lived in a place long enough, if the structure around them is insufficient to the task being demanded of it, the second cold reaches something that has nothing to do with the body at all. It gets into the marrow of resolve. It finds the precise location where a person keeps their belief that the morning will bring something other than the continuation of what the night delivered. And it works at that place the way water works at limestone, invisibly, patiently, without any intention of stopping. That cold does not announce itself as cold. It announces itself as certainty, as the quiet, inescapable logic of a situation that has already been decided. Clara Holt had spent 6 months learning to recognize it. She sat at the single table in the cabin on the shoulder of the mountain in the last week of September 1884 and watched her breath make small clouds in the air in front of her face. Not the extravagant plumes of deep winter, not yet just the faint suggestion of vapor appearing and dissolving with each exhale like a thought not fully formed. The oil lamp on the table cast a circle of amber light that made the walls look warmer than they were. She had learned not to trust the lamp. The lamp told a pleasant lie every evening, and every evening she accepted it because the children were still awake, and Ruth's face, lit from the side in that particular golden way, looked so much like her father's that Clara needed a moment to arrange her expression before she could speak to her without her voice betraying something. The children were asleep now. Ruth was 4 and slept the profound, committed sleep of the very young, her small body a tightly wound knot under 2 wool blankets, her dark hair fanned across the feed sack pillow. Thomas was 7 and slept differently on his back, one arm thrown overhead, his face occasionally troubled by dreams that made his brow contract and his lips move without producing sound. Clara sometimes sat at the table after they were both down and watched him sleep, trying to read what he was working through in those silent interior conversations. He had his father's way of going quiet when something was wrong. Edmund had done the same thing and retreated to some inner distance where he was visible but not reachable, processing the problem through layers of consideration that he would eventually surface from with either an answer or a deeper and more refined version of the question. Tom had not spoken much since April, not since the men from the Harker mining outfit had come to the cabin door, hats in hands, their faces carrying the practiced, collapsed expression of people delivering news they had delivered before. Clara had answered the door because Edmund was not there to answer it, and the fact that he was not there to answer it was itself the news they had come to deliver. The rockslide had happened fast, the way all geological events happen, the accumulation of 1,000 small pressures expressing themselves in a single catastrophic instant. The east face of the ridge where Edmund had been working a survey had been loosening for weeks, though he had noted it in his journals as a point of interest rather than a point of concern. He had not been a reckless man. He had been in certain specific ways a man whose fascination occasionally outran his caution, and in the particular way that it had outrun it, on the 14th of April, 1884, the consequence had been terminal. Clara had not opened his journals. She had stacked them in the wooden crate he used for storage and pushed the crate to the back of the cabin under the shelf where she kept the spare lantern wicks and the small tin of bear grease she used on the children's boots. She had walked past the crate every day for 6 months. She had not been ready for his handwriting. The letter from the Valley Consolidated Mining Company had arrived in August, delivered by a rider who made the trip up the mountain track with the careful expression of a man who was not certain his horse had the legs for it. The letter was courteous and businesslike and stated that the company had identified the whole property as containing timber resources of commercial interest, along with the possibility of a secondary ore vein running beneath the eastern section of the land, and that they wished to make an offer of purchase. The figure cited was not generous, but it was not insulting. It was the number that a company uses when it expects that the person receiving it is in a position to need it. The letter had sat on the table in its open envelope. For 2 weeks the pages held flat by the corner of the lamp base until the edges began to curl from the humidity, and Clara smoothed them out again. She had written a response in early September, polite and non-committal, asking for more time to consider. She had not told herself why she needed more time. She had gone on through the days of September doing what needed to be done: the root cellar inventory, the wood splitting, the patching and repatching of the north-facing wall, where 2 of the pine logs had dried and shrunk enough to open a gap the width of 2 fingers, and telling herself that time was what she needed. What she actually needed was for someone to tell her that she was wrong about the cabin, that the gap in the north wall was manageable, that the green-felled pine her husband had used in the framing, optimistic in the way that all first constructions on new land tend to be optimistic, would perform adequately against whatever the winter brought, that she was catastrophizing. Nobody told her that because it was not true, and the people of Prosperity Gulch did not traffic in comfortable untruths when the alternative was a dead woman and 2 orphaned children. Silas Brennan had come in the 3rd week of September, the way he came to most things directly without ceremony, motivated by a practical concern that he had already resolved in his own mind before the interaction began. He was 52 years old and had come to Colorado from coastal Maine in 1858, a young man with a strong back and a working knowledge of timber that he had spent 25 subsequent years converting into an unassailable expertise. He had built Prosperity Gulch not in any figurative sense, but in the specific literal sense that the wood for nearly every structure in it had been milled in his yard and cut to specification by his hands or the hands of the men he employed. He understood the behavior of wood under load, under temperature change, under the particular sustained assault of a Colorado winter, the way a physician understands the behavior of the body, not as a collection of abstract principles, but as a set of known tendencies observed in specific cases over a long time. He had stood on the porch of the cabin. He did not come inside. He did not need to. The exterior told him what he needed to know, and his eyes had moved over the roof line, the joinery, the walls, the window framing, with the systematic efficiency of an experienced assessor. The porch boards gave slightly under his weight in a way that established boards should not. He did not remark on it. "Those are green-felled pine, those wall logs." Not a question. His voice had the flat, declarative quality of a man who is not interested in softening information. Clara confirmed that they were. Edmund had cut them from the stand on the west side of the property the spring before construction, which she recognized now had not been enough time for proper curing, though she had not known enough at the time to flag it as a problem. "They've dried crooked." Brennan gestured at a section of the south wall where 2 of the logs had twisted subtly away from each other as they cured, creating a gap that the original chinking had only partially compensated for. "That chinking there, what's in it?" Clay and Grass Clara told him. Edmund's mix following a method from a book. Brennan looked at it a moment longer than necessary, which was his way of communicating a view without directly stating it. The chinking was crumbling at the edges. It had been adequate for the previous 2 winters, which had been moderate. This winter was already distinguishing itself, even in September, in ways that the old-timers discussed with a particular careful quality in their voices, the way men discuss something they have heard about but not personally survived. He did not look at her when he spoke the next part. He was still looking at the roof line where the peak showed a subtle downward bow that had not been there last spring. The Harker Company made you an offer. She said they had. It's reasonable, Orion. He finally turned to face her, and there was nothing unkind in his expression, just a specific absence of any quality that might be construed as accommodation. The land is worth more than what they're offering for the timber rights. If you press them on the mineral survey, you might get another 200 out of them, enough to set yourself and the children somewhere comfortable. The boarding house has 2 rooms available. My wife knows the woman who runs the laundry operation on Front Street. It's steady work. He had meant all of it as help. She understood that. The architecture of what he was describing was entirely sound cell relocate, stabilize, recover. It was the advice that any reasonable person looking at the situation from the outside would provide. She thanked him. He told her to think carefully and quickly because the window for making deliberate choices was narrowing as the weather indicators accumulated. He descended the mountain track on his horse with the squared-off posture of a man who had discharged a responsibility and expected his counsel to be followed because it was correct counsel, and he had not yet encountered a structural problem that did not eventually yield to the correct approach applied with sufficient conviction. The baskets came after that. 3 of the women from the Gulch organized a rotation, delivering them on alternating days dried beans, cornmeal, cured pork, once a small jar of preserved peaches that Ruth ate with a concentration and solemnity usually reserved for important ceremonies. Clara received each basket at the door, thanked the woman who brought it, and stood in the doorway until the horse or the wagon was out of sight before she allowed the expression she had been maintaining to relax. Pity, she had discovered, had a specific physical weight. It settled in the chest like a smooth river stone, not sharp enough to hurt, just present, constant, heavy, in a way that accumulated over repetitions. The women were not unkind. Their concern was genuine and in the specific circumstances entirely warranted. But the structure of the exchange, the basket, the careful cheerfulness, the slightly too long eye contact, the particular way they arranged their faces when they looked at Tom, who often watched from the window with his still serious expression, told a story about her situation that she did not want to become the only story, that she was a problem, that she was a tragedy conducting itself in installments, that the correct ending to her particular narrative involved someone else's charity and someone else's decision about where she should go next. She was 34 years old. She had grown up in Coshocton County, Ohio, the second of 4 children of a man who ran a smithing operation out of a converted barn and expected his children to learn the work regardless of their sex because the work needed doing, and small hands once trained were useful hands. She knew how to feed a forge. She knew the difference between a proper weld and a cold join that would fail under pressure. She knew from a childhood spent in a household where physical problems received physical solutions that most things that looked impossible were merely unfamiliar, and that unfamiliarity was a condition that yielded to sustained attention and sufficient stubbornness. She had not spent enough time being stubborn yet. She had spent 6 months being grief-struck and frightened and exhausted, which was the appropriate response to the preceding 6 months. But it had begun to harden into something else, a practiced acquiescence to the assessment that others had made of her situation, which was that the situation was over, and she simply had not acknowledged it yet. The letter from the mining company was still on the table when she went to get Edmund's crate from under the shelf. She had not planned to open it that evening. She had been packing, working her way through the practical contents of the cabin, separating what was worth transporting from what could be left, telling herself she was simply preparing, not deciding. She needed the crate to pack the cookware. She moved it out from under the shelf and lifted the lid to check whether it contained anything she had forgotten, and found herself looking at the stack of his journals. His handwriting on the spines, the way he labeled them, volume number, date range, location, and the precise, slightly cramped hand of someone who had taught himself to write with excessive care because his natural tendency was towards speed and illegibility. She had loved his handwriting. She had always had to hold his letters at a slight angle to read them because he wrote with a leftward slant that fought the baseline, and she had developed the habit so thoroughly that she sometimes tilted her head slightly to the left when reading anything. She sat down on the floor next to the crate. This was not a decision she made. She was simply sitting on the floor next to the crate, and the first journal was in her hands. The early volumes were technical geological surveys of the property and the surrounding terrain, written in a shorthand of abbreviations and specialized terminology that she moved through, slowly catching enough to follow the shape of his thinking, even where the specifics escaped her. He wrote about the land as a living system, a set of relationships between rock types, water movements, pressure dynamics that had been developing over timescales so vast that the word old became inadequate and had to be replaced with something closer to original. He found the mountain beautiful in the way that a person finds a complex argument, beautiful not aesthetically, but structurally, for the elegance of the underlying logic. The second set of journals was older. The covers were worn to a softness that new leather does not have, the pages browned at the edges, the binding repaired in two places with a different thread than the original. These were not Edmund's notes. These were his father's journals, William Holt of the Shenandoah Valley, a stonemason who had learned his trade from the generation of builders who had worked in the mountains of Virginia and the Western Carolinas before the war, men who had absorbed over a century of American construction a tradition of working with stone as a living heat-retaining material rather than merely a structural one. William Holt had written about warmth the way Edmund had written about geological strata, as a system to be understood rather than a problem to be overwhelmed. He described houses he had worked on in the mountain communities of Western Virginia, structures built into the hillsides with their backs against the rock, using the stable temperature of the deep earth as a buffer against the killing cold of the high-altitude winters. He wrote about masonry stoves, massive constructions of mortared stone, and fired brick built not for the quick, violent heat of a cast iron box, but for the slow accumulation and extended release of thermal energy, the way a stone wall holds the day's warmth into the evening long after the sun has moved. He called them the patient hearth. And in several passages, he contrasted them with what he called the shouting stove, the iron box that burned hot and fast and demanded constant feeding and sent most of its energy up the flue and out of the room in the relentless upward draft that it generated. Clara read until the lamp oil was nearly gone. She refilled it from the reserve tin and read further. At some point, Ruth made a small sound in her sleep and shifted, and Clara looked up long enough to confirm that she had resettled and then returned to the page. The passage she found near the back of William Holt's third journal was written in a different ink than the surrounding pages, suggesting it had been added later, possibly much later, as a summary of conclusions drawn from years of practice, rather than a record of specific experience. It read, "A shouting stove gives heat while the fire burns, and silence when it does not. A patient hearth gives warmth while the stone holds it, which is long after the fire itself has become memory. Build for the stone's memory, not the fire's voice." She set the journal down on the table and looked at the lamp for a while. Then she looked at the map Edmund had pinned to the wall near the window, a hand-drawn survey of the property detailed in the places that had interested him and gestural in the places that had not. The cabin, the creek, the aspen stand on the north side, the rock outcropping on the east ridge where the slide had occurred. On the far side of the survey, marked with a simple X in pencil and annotated in his cramped hand, Holt's Folly 60 feet. No commercial or geothermal anomaly. The question mark was his. He had written it as a note to himself, a thread left hanging, a thing to investigate when the current survey was complete, and he had time to circle back. He had mentioned the anomaly to her once in the offhand way he mentioned things that interested him before he was ready to talk about them properly. The rock stays warm, he had said, leaning in the doorway after coming back from the tunnel one afternoon, still brushing dust from his sleeves. Even in a frost. Strange. She had looked up from whatever she was doing and said something inquisitive, and he had said he would look into it, and then there had been dinner and Ruth wanting a story and the particular busyness of an evening with two young children, and the conversation had moved on the way. Conversations move on, and he had not come back to it in her hearing. She picked up the journal and read the passage about the patient hearth again. Then she looked at the X on the map. She did not sleep. By the time the sky began to lighten, not sunrise yet, just the first gray suggestion of it above the eastern ridge, she had fed the stove, dressed in her warmest practical clothes, lit the second lamp, and written a note in large letters on a piece of paper that she folded and placed on the table where Tom would see it when he woke. Gone to look at Dad's tunnel. Back before breakfast. Do not go outside. The entrance to the tunnel was on the far side of the property, a 10-minute walk from the cabin across terrain that was still unfrozen but had taken on the locked preliminary quality of ground preparing itself for winter. The brush around the opening had grown in over the months since Edmund had stopped working, its scrub oak and thorny wild rose that had taken advantage of the disturbed soil and the absence of any human activity to establish themselves with the opportunistic efficiency of plants that exist in partnership with neglect. She had brought the small hand axe and used it where the growth was too dense to push through. The entrance was lower than she remembered. Edmund had been a lean man, but broad-shouldered, and he had cut the opening to accommodate himself. She was neither short nor slight, but she could see that getting inside would require ducking and in places crawling. She cleared the worst of the debris, a rockfall of small stones just inside the entrance, probably dislodged from the ceiling by the frost and thaw cycles of the spring, and pushed inside with the lamp held ahead of her. The change was immediate, the way transitions in rock environments always are not gradual, but crossing a threshold as if the mountain had a defined interior edge. At 10 feet, the sound of the wind stopped, not diminished. Stopped. The silence was not the silence of a quiet outdoor morning. It was the silence of a place that existed outside the acoustic reach of the surface world, entirely a silence with texture and weight. At 20 feet, the quality of the air shifted. The cold that had been pressing in from the entrance softened. The air was cool, not cold. The lamp flame, which had been guttering in the slight draft near the entrance, steadied and burned straight. At 30 feet, the coolness was gone. The air was neutral, the way air is neutral only in places that are not subject to the swings of outdoor temperature root cellars, deep wells, the lower levels of old stone buildings with walls thick enough to buffer the seasons. Not warm, absent of cold, which at 30 feet inside a Colorado mountain in late September was a different and more significant thing. The tunnel was narrow and she had to move carefully, holding the lamp to one side to keep from burning her forearm on the low ceiling. The floor was rough blasted and dug in the purposeful but unpretty way of a man working alone, more concerned with forward progress than finished surfaces. The walls caught the lamplight on the quartz inclusions and threw it back in small, cold sparks, so that moving through the tunnel felt like moving through something that was almost alive, a space that had its own internal luminosity. At 60 feet, the tunnel ended in a solid wall of granite. She stood in the close lamplit space and faced the rock. The wall was not smooth. It had the natural fracture pattern of undisturbed stone, the lines and planes along which it had been laid down over periods of time, long enough to make the word period feel inadequate. There was a crack running vertically through the upper section, narrow at the bottom, and widening slightly as it rose, disappearing into the ceiling. She could not feel air movement from it directly, but the lamp flame held toward the crack leaned not from any draft she could detect, but from some subtle movement that the flame registered before her skin did. She placed her palm flat against the wall. The stone was not cold. She had expected cold, the cold of deep earth, the cold of rock that the sun has never touched. She pressed harder, waiting for the chill to come through. It did not come. The rock was not warm in the way that a sun-heated stone is warm, retaining energy borrowed from an external source. This warmth was internal, constant. The mountain was producing it from somewhere below, from processes that Edmund had cataloged in his notebooks, with the careful excitement of a man who has found something genuinely unusual. And it was rising slowly, steadily, with the unhurried certainty of something that has been doing this for longer than the concept of winter has existed. She stood with her hand against the warm stone for a long time. When she came back out into the September morning, the light had fully arrived, clean and sharp and indifferent, and she stood at the mouth of the tunnel with rock dust on her clothes and raw skin on her knuckles, and the lamp still warm in her hand. The cabin was visible from here, the gap in the north wall that she had been stuffing with rags, the bowed roof line, the porch boards that gave under Brennan's weight. She looked at it for a long moment, not with the grief she had been carrying since April, not with the fear she had been moving through for weeks, but with the specific cold clarity of a craftsman's daughter, looking at a piece of work and identifying precisely where it has failed and why. The cabin was not the answer. The cabin had never been designed to be the answer to a winter like the one the old-timers were already naming in hushed voices. It was an optimistic structure built by a man who understood rock better than he understood timber, and it would not stand against what was coming. But 60 feet inside the mountain, there was a wall of granite that was warm to the touch. In a worn leather journal written by a Virginia stonemason, there were instructions for building a hearth that spoke to stone instead of shouting at air. The thought arrived whole, the way the most audacious thoughts tend to arrive, not in increments, but all at once, its implications assembling themselves simultaneously rather than sequentially, so that by the time she had finished having the thought, she already understood both what it required and how much of it was probably beyond her. She went back inside the cabin and made breakfast. Tom came out of sleep, slowly the way he always did, surfacing through layers of whatever interior world he inhabited in his dreams before arriving blinking and slightly rumpled at the table. She put cornmeal mush in front of him and Ruth, who had woken with her customary abruptness and was already fully present and opinionated about the quality of the morning. Clara watched her children eat and made herself think through the practical requirements without allowing herself to stop at the difficulty of any individual one. Clearing the floor of 60 feet of tunnel, widening the entrance in a section of the interior to habitable dimensions, laying drainage gravel in a stone floor, sourcing clay, sand, and straw for brickmaking, building a kiln, firing enough brick, constructing the masonry stove itself, the firebox, the labyrinthine internal passages, the connection to the natural fissure that would serve as the flue. All of it by hand, by herself, with the partial assistance of a 7-year-old who was willing but small, before the polar vortex that the old-timers' eyes predicted when they looked at the September sky. She got up from the table, went to the shelf where the mining company's letter sat in its opened envelope, took the pages out and held them over the lamp flame until they caught. She set the burning paper in the cook stove and watched it finish. Tom watched her do this without commenting. He had his father's gift for observing significant events with appropriate solemnity rather than demanding immediate explanation. He looked at the small fire in the stove, then at his mother's face, then back at his cornmeal mush. "Are we staying?" His voice was careful, feeling the weight of the question before committing to it. Clara sat back down at the table. "We're staying." She looked at him steadily, but not in the cabin. "I need to show you something. Finish eating first." She took him to the tunnel after breakfast, leaving Ruth at the cabin with a stern instruction to remain indoors and the inducement of the small rag doll Edmund had made for her the previous Christmas. She brought both lamps and the lantern and entered ahead of Tom, holding the light so that he could see the walls as they progressed. She felt the moment when he registered the shift at 30 feet when the cold definitively ended. His hand, which had been gripping the back of her coat, relaxed. At 60 feet, she held the lamp near the fissure and watched his eyes track the lean of the flame. She placed his hand flat against the warm granite. He held it there for a long moment, his small face serious in the lamplight, absorbing the sensation with the attentiveness of his father's child. It's warm, not a question, a careful statement of a fact he wanted to verify by saying aloud. She confirmed it. Why is it warm? She told him as simply and accurately as she could what she understood from Edmund's notes, that far below them, the earth produced its own heat from pressures and processes deep in the rock, that it rose slowly through the layers, and that in this particular place, for reasons Edmund had been in the middle of understanding, when he died, the heat was close enough to the surface to be felt. She told him about his grandfather, William Holt's journals, and about the patient hearth, and about the difference between heat that shouts and heat that tells a long story to the stone. He was quiet for several breaths after she finished. Then, Dad knew about this. She said that Edmund had known about it and had not had the chance to do anything with it yet. Tom looked at the warm wall again, and something in his expression settled. Not grief exactly, but the particular quality of a recognition that connects something lost to something present. He nodded once with the gravity of someone making a private decision and did not speak again until they were back in the daylight. The work began that afternoon. She started at the entrance, pulling rockfall by hand and carrying it in the front of her apron, one load at a time, to the pile she was building 20 feet from the mouth of the tunnel. Tom carried the smaller stones individually, his jaw set, making more trips than she did, but covering the same ground with the stubborn arithmetic of someone who has identified the task and is not going to stop until it is done. They worked until the light failed. At dinner, Ruth, who had spent the day in the cabin with her rag doll, in an increasingly bold investigation of every cabinet she could reach, reported her findings from the afternoon's exploration with the thoroughness of a naturalist. Clara let her talk and ate and thought about drainage gravel and where on the property the right flat stones were likely to be found. She already knew the creek. She already knew approximately how many loads it would take. That night, after the children were asleep, she opened William Holt's journals again and began making notes of her own in the margins in pencil dimensions, material quantities, sequence of construction. The lamp burned steadily. Outside, the wind moved through the aspen stand with the sound that aspen always makes, the particular dry rushing that is unlike any other sound in nature, and which she had loved since the first autumn she spent on this mountain. The first night she had spent in the cabin, Edmund had pointed out that particular stand of aspen from the window and told her that botanists believed an aspen grove was often a single organism, one root system sending up hundreds of individual trunks connected underground in ways that were not visible from the surface. He had been delighted by this. The idea that what appeared to be a collection of separate things was actually one continuous thing linked at the root seemed to him like a beautiful argument for paying attention to what lay beneath the visible surface of things. She had thought of that often in the months since April. She thought of it now, listening to the aspen in the night wind, making her notes in the margin of his father's journal. She did not know if she could do what she was planning to do. She knew the principles. She did not know if her hands could execute them accurately enough, if her kiln would burn hot enough to make serviceable brick, if the fissure in the rock would function as the natural flue that Edmund's flame had suggested it might. She did not know if the timeline was achievable before the weather made working outdoors impossible. What she knew was the warm wall at 60 feet. What she knew was William Holt's patient hearth. What she knew was that the alternative was a boarding house room and laundry work and the slow erasure of every remaining connection to the mountain, in the man, in the life she had come to this place to build. She turned the page and kept writing. The gravel came first because everything else depended on it. William Holt's journal was specific on this point in a way that suggested hard experience rather than theoretical preference. A masonry hearth built on a floor that held moisture would crack along its base within the first season of use, the thermal cycling working at the mortar joints, the way a wedge works at a seam, not destroying immediately but establishing the geometry of eventual failure. The foundation had to be dry. The floor of the tunnel, 60 feet of blasted rock and accumulated debris, was not dry. It was the floor of a place that had been sealed and dark and subject to the slow weeping of underground water for the months since Edmund had abandoned it, and it had the particular damp heaviness of a space that has never been given the chance to breathe. Clara spent 3 days on drainage alone before she laid a single stone. She dug a shallow trench down the center of the tunnel floor, 6 inches deep and 8 inches wide, sloping imperceptibly toward the entrance, a grade she established by filling a long-necked bottle with water and watching where the surface settled. The trench she packed was small, clean creek gravel, the kind that allows water to move through it rather than pooling in it, then layered coarser gravel over the entire floor to a depth of 4 inches before the flat stones could go down. The flat stones she had identified weeks earlier during the work of clearing the entrance, a ledge of shale outcropping along the creek bank 40 yards from the tunnel, mouth splitting naturally into pieces of the right thickness if she hit them at the correct angle with the back of the pickaxe. She learned the angle by feel over 2 afternoons of failed attempts and one successful one, and after that, the stones came away cleanly. Tom carried. He did not complain about this. He had arrived at some private understanding of the work, its purpose, its scale, its relationship to the thing that had been taken from them in April. And he approached each day with a steady, almost adult purposefulness that Clara found both moving and at moments quietly alarming, in the way that children who are growing up faster than they should be are always slightly alarming. He organized the stones by size without being asked. He developed a system for loading the wheelbarrow that maximized capacity without overloading it past what he could manage on the uphill section of the path, a problem he solved through observation and iteration, rather than asking her advice, which was exactly what Edmund would have done. Ruth was 4 and therefore not part of the labor organization, but she was emphatically part of everything else. She stationed herself at the mouth of the tunnel each morning with the rag doll and a small wooden cup she had decided was her equipment, and she maintained a running commentary on events visible from that position, the progress of clouds, the behavior of the camp robber jays who had identified the property as a source of potential food, the quality of the stones Tom was carrying relative to previous stones. Occasionally, she wandered further than Clara was comfortable with and would be retrieved and reestablished at her post without significant complaint. She was a child of extreme opinions and flexible attachment to any individual one of them, which made her simultaneously exhausting and resilient in ways that Clara found increasingly essential. The brick making occupied a full week and consumed more of her physical reserves than she had budgeted for it. The clay she had located in August, during a creek bank survey she had undertaken after Edmund's geological notes, mentioned a deposit of suitable composition on the property's lower boundary. She had not known then what she would need it for. She had simply noted it as a fact about the land, the way she was learning to note facts about the land, rather than letting them pass through without registration. 40 pounds of clay per trip packed into the canvas sacks she had emptied of their cornmeal, carried 300 yards uphill, on a back that was already beginning to categorize pain by type and severity, rather than registering it as noteworthy. The mix was from William Holt's notes: 3 parts clay to 1 part sharp sand to 1 part chopped straw, short enough to be thoroughly incorporated, long enough to provide tensile reinforcement in the green state. The proportions had to be correct. Too much clay and the bricks would crack on drying. Too much sand and they would crumble under mechanical stress. The straw had to be dry. She had discovered this by making a test batch with straw from the cabin floor that retained some residual moisture, and watching the resulting bricks develop surface fractures as they dried that propagated inward with a thoroughness that made the entire batch unusable. She built the kiln from loose stone in the open ground south of the tunnel entrance, a simple updraft design she adapted from a passage in William Holt's second journal that described a field kiln his own father had constructed during a period of working in an area without access to commercial brick. She fired it with the driest hardwood she had, the seasoned oak splits Edmund had laid in the previous autumn for the cabin stove, now redirected to a purpose he had not anticipated. The first firing ran too cool. She recognized it by the color of the bricks when she opened the kiln and found them the dull tan of under-fired clay rather than the deeper reddish orange that indicated adequate vitrification. She refired. The second run was better. The bricks were ugly, uneven surfaces, a few with small cracks at the corners, several with slight warps from uneven heat distribution in the kiln. But when she struck them against each other, they produced a clean, hard ring rather than the dull thud of insufficiently fired clay. And when she pressed her thumbnail against the face of one, it left no mark. They would hold. Brennan came on a Tuesday in the second week of October, which she knew was a Tuesday only because she had been keeping a tally on the cabin wall and had counted back to establish the day, an exercise that had taken longer than it should have because she had lost 3 days somewhere in the intensity of the preceding weeks. He rode up rather than walked, which she noted the deliberateness of the choice, the extra formality of the horse, as if he had decided this visit warranted the additional authority of arriving mounted. She was mixing a test batch of mortar when she heard the horse, and she stayed with the mixing because the mortar had a window of workability that did not accommodate interruption. He dismounted and stood at a distance reading the situation, the clay pit, the stacked brick, the raw mouth of the widened tunnel entrance, the wheelbarrow she had modified with a board extension to carry longer stones with the systematic attention of a man cataloging evidence for a conclusion he was already forming. She finished the mix, covered it with the wet cloth she kept for the purpose, and turned to face him. He looked at the brick stack. He looked at the kiln. He looked at the tunnel entrance, which she had widened in the 10 days since he had last seen the property from a distance, enough that she could walk in without ducking if she kept her shoulders slightly forward. His expression had acquired a quality it had not had during his first visit. Not displeasure exactly, but the particular tightening of a face around a concern that is resolving itself from vague to specific. He walked to the tunnel entrance and looked in. She had lamp brackets fixed to the walls at 10-foot intervals by then, and the interior was lit well enough that he could see the laid stone floor, the widened chamber section at 40 feet, the dim brick-stacked shape of the in-progress stove structure at the far end. He looked at it for a long time. He turned back to face her, and his voice, when he spoke, had the quality of a man who has rehearsed several versions of a conversation and settled on the one that is direct without being deliberately harsh. I have been building in these mountains since before this town existed. I have built through 3 hard winters and 1 winter that killed 14 people in the valley below us. I know what cold does to a structure, and I know what a structure needs to keep it out. He looked at the tunnel entrance again. That is not a structure. That is a hole in the ground with a clay pell inside it. She waited. There was more, and she knew the shape of it before it arrived. I want to say something to you that is not about the engineering. He was looking at her now with a directness that was not unkind but was also not soft. My wife and I have the space. We have 2 daughters and they would be company for your children. Ruth and Tom could sleep in the back room through the winter in comfort and safety, and no one in this town would think less of you for making that choice. It would be the right choice for them. Whatever you believe about what you're building here, I am asking you to separate that question from the question of your children's welfare, because those are 2 different questions, and one of them is not about you. The argument landed exactly where he had aimed it, and he knew it, and he was not wrong that it was the right argument to make. She stood with it and did not answer immediately, which she thought he probably interpreted as wavering, and which was not wavering, but was the appropriate response to a position that deserved to be genuinely considered rather than reflexively dismissed. She looked at the brick stack. She looked at the tunnel entrance. She thought about Ruth sleeping in a warm room in the Brennan house, fed and safe, and removed from the specific uncertainty of what Clara was attempting. She thought about Tom in that same room further from the tunnel and from Edmund's journals and from the warm wall at 60 feet. She said, I hear what you're telling me, and I appreciate that it comes from genuine concern. She met his eyes steadily. The answer is no, but I appreciate it. He was not finished. He moved closer to the tunnel entrance and pointed into the interior at the stove structure, the half-built firebox, the first courses of the labyrinthine flue passages, the rough and visually chaotic assemblage of hand-fired brick in mortared stone that looked in fairness nothing like any heating apparatus he had ever seen in 25 years of construction. That will not draw. A cold flue kills the draft, the gases reverse, and you pump smoke into a sealed space. His voice had shifted from the register of personal appeal to the register of technical authority. And in that register, it was considerably harder to remain unaffected by because it was built on a foundation of things that were true. Even if the fissure vents as you're expecting, you don't know its capacity or its geometry past the first 3 feet. You are betting your children's lives on a crack in the rock that you cannot fully inspect. She had thought about this. She had been thinking about it in the hours before sleep and the hours before full wakefulness for weeks, turning the uncertainty over and examining it from multiple angles. The fissure was the variable she could not fully control. Everything else in the design was knowable, calculable, adjustable. The fissure was the place where her plan met the interior of the mountain on the mountain's own terms. I know it's a risk, she said. Everything in front of us right now is a risk. The cabin is a risk that I can measure. I've measured it. The cabin doesn't survive what's coming. She kept her voice even. The question isn't whether there's risk. The question is which kind. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that moved through several things in quick succession: assessment, frustration, something that might have been reluctant respect if she was reading it correctly, then the settled quality of a man who has discharged his responsibility and cannot compel compliance. When the snows come, he said, I will not be in a position to send men up here. You understand that? She understood it. He mounted his horse and rode down the mountain track without looking back, and she watched him go and felt the precise quality of the severance, the last functional connection to the organized life of the gulch, the last context in which she was a person receiving assistance, rather than a figure of concern that had been formally and publicly relinquished. She was the widow who had refused reasonable help. She was the woman in the hole. She was in the specific collective vocabulary of a small mountain town in 1884, the cautionary tale that was going to provide a winter's worth of grim confirmation to people who already believed they knew how the story ended. She went back to the mortar. The explanation of what she was building, its underlying physics, the reason it would work, where an iron stove would fail, exists outside the story's timeline. In the way that understanding always exists outside the timeline of events, it illuminates. A person watching Clara Holt carry brick into a tunnel on an October mountainside in 1884 would have seen the labor without seeing the logic. The logic is this. Silas Brennan's world was built around the cast iron stove, and the cast iron stove is an instrument of convection. It burns wood at high temperature, rapidly heating its metal body, which rapidly heats the air immediately surrounding it. Hot air, being less dense than cool air, rises to the ceiling and creates a pressure differential that pushes it outward through every available exit, every crack in the roof line, every imperfect seam between boards, every gap in the window framing where the wood has shrunk away from the glass. As that hot air escapes, it pulls replacement air in from outside. This is the stack effect, and it is the fundamental thermodynamic problem of a conventional heated structure. The stove is not heating a room. The stove is heating a continuous column of air that is moving through the room on its way from outside to outside, spending only a brief period inside before escaping and being replaced by more cold air that also requires heating. In a moderate winter, a well-built house can manage this exchange. In a polar vortex, the stack effect becomes a siphon, actively accelerating the extraction of warmth from the interior and replacing it with outdoor air at temperatures that the stove cannot process fast enough. The stove gets hotter. The room gets colder. This is not a failure of the stove. It is a structural limitation of the principle. Clara's masonry hearth operated on a categorically different principle. It was not a convective instrument. It was a thermal capacitor. The firebox burned hot and fast, not a sustained moderate burn, but a brief intense one, the fire reaching temperatures that extracted maximum energy from minimum fuel. The flue gases did not rise directly out of the building. They were forced by the geometry of the stove's internal architecture through a serpentine passage of mortared brick and stone that ran back and forth and up and down through the massive body of the stove, 60 to 70 linear feet of internal travel, packed into the physical footprint of a structure roughly 4 feet square and 6 feet tall. By the time the gases reached the fissure and escaped to the surface, they were cool to the touch. They had surrendered their thermal energy to the masonry. The stove was now charged. For the next 18 to 24 hours, that charged masonry would radiate, not convect radiate. Thermal radiation travels in electromagnetic waves, the same fundamental mechanism as visible light, and it does not require a medium. It warms objects directly. The stone walls of the tunnel, the laid stone floor, the wooden platform beds the people sitting within range without first warming the air they breathe. There is no rising column of heated air generating pressure. There is no stack effect. The radiant energy moves outward in all directions from the warm mass absorbed by whatever surfaces it encounters, and those surfaces become gentle secondary radiators in turn, so that the entire room becomes a distributed heat source rather than a single point of intense local warmth surrounded by zones of cold. The mountain provided the rest. At 60 feet below the surface, the rock maintained a stable temperature through every season, not warm enough to be comfortable on its own, but impervious to the temperature swings of the surface. No polar vortex, no matter how catastrophic, could meaningfully alter the thermal state of several thousand tons of granite. The tunnel was not a room added to the surface of the mountain. It was a room subtracted from the interior of it, surrounded on 5 sides by rock that had not changed its temperature in a meaningful way since before anyone living had been born. One system shouted at the cold and fed it, and spent itself in the argument. The other asked the stone to remember warmth, and the stone, having been doing exactly that since long before the argument began, simply continued. The fissure occupied her attention for 4 days in the 3rd week of October, and those 4 days were the most demanding of the entire construction, not physically but cognitively. The work of finding and confirming the connection between the stove location and the natural vent that Edmund's flame had detected required a sustained patient attention that had to be maintained in conditions of poor light, physical discomfort, and the continual low-frequency anxiety about whether the connection existed in a form that was actually usable. She found the fissure by listening. Edmund's note had described it as running from near the base of the end wall upward, through the ceiling and presumably to the surface. But precisely where it intersected the ceiling was not something she could determine visually in lamplight. What she could do, and what she spent 2 days doing, was tap. She worked her way across the ceiling of the tunnel's end section with the back of the small hammer, listening to the difference between the solid report of intact rock and the subtly hollower sound of rock over a void. The difference was not dramatic, it was the auditory equivalent of the difference between pressing on a drum at the center versus pressing near the rim. But once she had heard it in one place and confirmed it by chiseling carefully through to the void behind it, she had the reference and could trace the line of it through the ceiling. The fissure ran from the base of the end wall upward at an angle of roughly 40 degrees, intersecting the ceiling approximately 18 inches back from the wall face, and continuing. She could not see how far, but the hammer tapping told her it continued, and the fact that Edmund's flame had detected upward movement in the air near the wall face suggested it reached the surface with enough connectivity to allow natural draft. The channel she needed to cut between the stove's planned flue exit and the fissure was 14 inches of solid granite. She cut it in half-inch increments over 11 days, working by lamplight, chiseling, then clearing debris, then chiseling again, keeping the channel angled to preserve natural draft geometry. This is the part of the story that the finished product does not reveal: the 11 days of lamplight work in a space barely wide enough to operate a chisel at the right angle, the accumulated bruises from the backswing of the hammer against the tunnel wall, the particular physical toll of work performed entirely above shoulder height for hours at a time. The finished channel was 4 inches wide and 3 inches tall, following the line of a natural fracture plane in the granite, Wherever the granite provided one diverging from that plane, only where it did not run in the necessary direction. It was not elegant. 14 inches of connection between 2 points, achieved through 11 days of sustained manual effort in near darkness. Every strike of the hammer was a commitment. She had passed the point where the work could be undone and salvaged into a different plan. The channel in the granite was permanent. Either it worked or it did not, and if it did not, the option of the boarding house room and the laundry work had moved from the future into the past somewhere in the second week of October on one of the 11 days she had not tracked carefully enough to name. Tom had started doing something she noticed at the beginning of the third week. He had taken the simplest of her working drawings, the elevation sketch of the stove she had adapted from William Holt's journal, and was redrawing it in pencil on sheets of brown paper she had cut from the backing of a supply package. Not copying it slavishly, but working from it, making his own version of it, in a hand that was surer than it should have been for a 7-year-old who had not been formally taught to draw. He added notations she had not put in the original small numbers near the dimensions question marks at the sections he was uncertain about. He worked on it in the evenings after dinner by the lamp with the concentration of someone solving a problem that they have decided is theirs to solve. She did not comment on it for several days. When she finally asked him about a specific notation, he had added a question mark near the flue entry point of the firebox. He explained his uncertainty about the transition geometry with a precision that told her he had been thinking about it for longer than she had realized. She showed him Edmund's journal entry on the same question. He read it slowly, moving his lips slightly. Then he picked up his pencil and answered his own question mark. The two women who brought food in the third week of October came separately and on different days, which she understood was not coincidence. Margaret Sutter came first, the wife of one of the Harker mining crew foremen, a broad-shouldered, practically minded woman who had crossed the Kansas plains in a covered wagon at age 11 and had a well-calibrated sense of what constituted a survivable situation and what did not. She stood at the edge of the clay pit and looked at the construction progress with an expression that Clara recognized as genuine assessment rather than performed concern. Brennan told James it's madness. Margaret set the covered basket down on the flat rock Clara used as a work table. James agrees with Brennan. I told James that Brennan has been wrong about 3 things in the time I've known him, and this might be the 4th. She looked at the tunnel entrance. Is it going to work? Clara considered the question seriously because Margaret was asking it seriously. The science of it will work. The question is whether my execution of it is good enough. Margaret nodded the nod of a woman who understood the difference between principle and execution from long experience of attempting to translate one into the other. She did not ask further questions. She left the basket and rode back down. Brennan found out. Clara did not know exactly how small mountain communities. Being small mountain communities, the information did not require active transmission, but the delivery stopped after that. Margaret sent a note on the third day brief, and without apology or extensive explanation, Silas says it only extends the situation. He's not wrong about the reasoning, even if I think he might be wrong about the outcome. I'm sorry, Clara. She read it and put it in the stove and did not allow herself to interpret it as anything other than the information it contained. The isolation after that was of a different character than the isolation before. Before, she had been alone in the way that a person pursuing an unusual plan is alone, separated from others by the specificity of her intention, which others could not share because they could not follow the logic to the same destination. Now she was alone in the way that a person who has been formally abandoned is alone, separated from others by a judgment that had been made and communicated and acted upon. The town had not turned hostile. It had turned away, which in practical terms on a mountain in late October amounted to the same thing. The stove was done on the 28th of October. She knew it was the 28th because she had been keeping the wall tally again with obsessive regularity since Brennan's second visit, and she had crossed off each day with the particular deliberateness of someone tracking a deadline whose consequences she did not want to lose sight of. The stove was a large, ungainly, architecturally complex structure that bore no visual resemblance to anything a person who had only seen cast iron stoves would recognize as a heating apparatus. It was 4 feet at its widest, 6 feet tall, built of her hand-fired brick, mortared with the clay mix incorporating a firebox at the base, with an ash door she had made from a piece of scrap iron salvaged from the collapsed sluice box on the property's lower boundary, and above the firebox, a series of internal passages arranged in the geometry that William Holt's notes described as the smoke maze, a back and forth, up and down serpentine that increased the total internal path of the flue gases from the approximately 3 feet of a direct vertical connection to over 60 linear feet of heat-exchanging surface. The connection to the granite fissure was a 4-inch channel cut through 14 inches of rock. She had sealed the interface between the brick structure and the stone channel with a mortar mix weighted toward fire clay, which was more resistant to the thermal cycling of the connection point than standard clay mortar. She looked at it for a long time the evening she declared it done. It was not beautiful. It was the thing she had been working toward for 6 weeks, rendered in materials that she had processed by hand from the raw substances available within a quarter-mile of where she stood in conditions of increasing cold and isolation, with a 7-year-old as her primary labor assistant. It was the most technically complex thing she had ever built, assembled from knowledge that had traveled from a Virginia stonemason through his son's journals, to her hands in a mountain tunnel in Colorado. Whether it worked was still, until she lit it, an open question. She moved the last of the essential household contents into the tunnel on the 29th. Bedding, cookware, the food stores, Edmund's journals, the children's things. She made up the 2 platform beds she had built from salvaged lumber against the widened section's walls. Ruth inspected the arrangements with the thoroughness of a very small building inspector and declared the bed acceptable, but expressed reservations about the rag rug's positioning, which Clara adjusted. Tom sat on his bed and looked at the stove for several minutes without speaking. On the 30th, she closed the cabin. She did not go through it room by room. She stood in the doorway for a moment, took in the fact of it, the gap in the north wall she had stuffed with rags, the bowed roof line, the lamp hook where the lamp no longer hung because the lamp was in the tunnel now, then pulled the door closed. The latch caught. She did not look back as she walked away. The sky on the morning of October 31st had the color and the quality of light that she now recognized as the thing the old-timer's eyes had been reading in September, the flat, bruised purple-gray that was not the color of an ordinary storm front, but the color of a meteorological event of a different category entirely, something that the sky itself seemed reluctant to contain. The light came from everywhere and nowhere, directionless, diffused with a quality that made familiar objects look slightly strange, as if they had been replaced during the night by very accurate copies. The wind had died completely. In the aspen stand, not a single leaf moved. She had the children in the tunnel before noon. The mitten-thick, tanned elk hide she had cut and hung over the entrance blocked the wind and most of the draft without blocking the small amount of natural light that the entrance received, and she had rigged a line inside so it could be secured from within. She built the first fire in the stove at 2 in the afternoon. Dry hardwood split to finger-width pieces to maximize surface area and combustion rate stacked in the firebox in the configuration that William Holt's notes specified. Not a slow, smothered burn, but a hot, complete one, the fire reaching its maximum temperature quickly and sustaining it until the fuel was consumed. She lit it, closed the firebox door, and stood back. Tom stood beside her. Ruth was behind them both, pressed against the back of Tom's legs, with her rag doll held against her chest. They waited. 5 minutes. The stove's exterior surface was not yet warm to the touch, which was correct. The thermal mass would take time to charge, and the gases would be moving through the internal passages rather than heating the outer surface directly. 10 minutes. A faint warmth at the lower section of the stove face where the firebox sat. Correct. 20 minutes. She held her hand near the channel entry to the granite fissure. Nothing detectable there yet. Ruth tugged the back of Tom's coat and whispered something. He shook his head slightly, a small gesture of focused attention that meant not yet. At 31 minutes, Tom said quietly and with certainty, "Mom." She looked where he was pointing. At the mouth of the tunnel, the lower edge of the elk hide curtain, where the hide met the stone floor. A slow, barely visible movement of air curling the edge of the hide inward toward them. The stove was creating draw. The fissure was carrying the exhaust upward. The system was moving air in the correct direction. She pressed the back of her hand against the stove's upper section. Warm, building. Outside, the first snow began. Not gentle, the hard, hissing pellets of a polar vortex's leading edge hitting the rock face above the tunnel entrance with a sound like static building in intensity from the moment it started. Within an hour, the sound of the wind returned, not as a weather feature, but as a structural force, something that pressed against the mountain and against the tunnel entrance, and tried with absolute impersonal commitment to enter. It did not enter. The mountain absorbed it. Tom's voice in the lamplight, even carrying the weight of something understood rather than felt. Dad would have liked this. She looked at her son's face in the warm amber light. He looked like Edmund looking at something that had confirmed a hypothesis, not triumphant, but satisfied in the way that understanding produces satisfaction, quieter and more durable than excitement. She thought about the X on Edmund's map. She thought about the question mark at the end of his last journal entry, the thread left hanging that she had picked up and followed to this moment. He knew it was here, she said. He just did not have time to build it. Tom nodded once with a gravity that exceeded his years and precisely matched the moment. Ruth, who had been following the conversation with the focused uncertainty of a 4-year-old tracking adult significance, looked between them and then pressed her face into Tom's shoulder, which was her habitual response to situations whose emotional content she recognized but could not yet fully categorize. The stove was warm under Clara's hands. The stone floor was warm under their feet. The walls were beginning to store what the stove was releasing. Outside, the white death that the old-timers had been reading in the September sky for weeks had arrived, and it was everything they had predicted. The kind of winter that does not negotiate, that does not observe prior agreements about what structures are supposed to be able to withstand, that comes with the force of a geological event wearing weather's name. Inside the mountain, the patient hearth did what it had always been designed to do. It spoke to the stone in the language of slow heat. The stone as stone does remembered. The storm did not build, it arrived. There is a difference, and anyone who has experienced both knows it immediately and in the body rather than the mind. A building storm has a grammar, a prologue of increasing wind, a darkening that progresses through stages, a series of escalating statements that give the observer time to read the argument and prepare a response. What descended on Prosperity Gulch on the first day of November 1884 had no prologue. The hard pellets of the leading edge had given perhaps 2 hours of warning, and then the sky simply closed. The way a hand closes, and everything that had existed as a visible, navigable world became a single undifferentiated white force that moved horizontally with the weight and commitment of something that had been traveling a very long distance and had arrived at its destination. The sound it made against the mountain was not wind sound. Wind has a pitch, a variation, a musical quality in even its most violent expressions. This was below music. It was pressure rendered as noise, a continuous physical roar that operated at the frequency of structural stress, the frequency at which timber checks and mortar crumbles and the confidence of builders meets the arithmetic of actual load. The aspen stand, which had survived decades of Colorado winters, lost 7 trees in the first 6 hours. Clara heard none of this. At 40 feet inside the mountain, surrounded by the particular silence of deep rock, the storm existed only as an abstraction. She knew it was there the way a person knows a fact they have not witnessed intellectually, with full confidence in its truth, but without the visceral registration that direct experience produces. The elk hide curtain at the tunnel entrance moved sometimes a slow, pressured bulge inward that released and repeated the mountain's skin breathing with the rhythm of the gale outside. That was all. That was the total physical presence of the worst winter storm in the recorded history of the Colorado high country, as experienced from 60 feet inside the granite, that had been absorbing and outlasting such events since before the concept of recorded history existed in this part of the continent. She fed the stove at 6 in the morning and again at noon, each firing brief and hot. The hardwood gone to coals within 40 minutes and the firebox doors sealed again. The stove's exterior surface, which had reached its working temperature on the afternoon of the first day, maintained it with the even unhurried persistence of thermal mass that has been properly charged, not hot enough to blister a carelessly placed hand, but warm enough that pressing a palm flat against the brick produced a spreading, penetrating heat that moved through the skin and into the deeper tissue in the way that deep warmth always does, the way sunlight on the back of the neck on a cold afternoon moves inward rather than staying at the surface. The walls of the tunnel had been absorbing the stove's radiant output since the previous afternoon. By the morning of the first full storm day, the stone on both sides of the chamber registered warmth at the surface, and the floor, the carefully laid flat stones over their bed of gravel, over their drainage trench, was the first thing Ruth noticed each morning, pressing her bare feet to it with the concentrated pleasure of a child discovering that something unexpected is also something wonderful. Ruth had adapted to subterranean life with a speed and thoroughness that Claire found both relieving and slightly remarkable. She had conducted a complete inventory of the space on the first morning, cataloging its features with the systematic attention she applied to all new environments, and had established territorial arrangements for her belongings that she communicated to Tom through a combination of direct statement and the placement of the rag doll as a boundary marker. She had opinions about the lamp height. She had opinions about where the bread should cool. She was in the tunnel exactly who she was in the cabin, which meant the tunnel had passed her fundamental test of habitability. It was a place where she could continue being herself without significant modification. Tom was different. The tunnel had not made Tom more himself. It had made him more concentrated, the way a substance becomes more concentrated when water is removed from it, the same essential composition but denser, more present in each small volume of expression. He worked on his drawings in the evenings with a focus that excluded ambient noise and conversation, the pencil moving with increasing sureness across the brown paper, the lines becoming more deliberate and better understood as the days accumulated, and he cross-referenced them against William Holt's journal with the methodical patience of someone who is not studying for a test, but acquiring knowledge they intend to use. On the second day of the storm, while Clara was mending the knee of Tom's trousers, she became aware that Tom had stopped drawing and was watching her with a particular quality of attention that meant he was about to say something he had been holding for a while. His voice was careful and precise, the way it was when he had organized his thinking fully before beginning. The smoke passages in the stove, the ones that go back and forth inside Grandfather William, called them the maze. But they're not a maze. A maze is meant to confuse. These are meant to slow something down so it gives up what it has. He looked at his drawing. It's more like a conversation than a maze. The smoke has to keep talking to the brick until it runs out of things to say. She set the mending down and looked at her son for a moment. He was 7 years old. He was sitting in a tunnel his father had started, and his mother had finished explaining the thermodynamic principle of the extended flue path in a metaphor that was structurally more accurate than the one she had been using in her own thinking. "That's exactly right," she said. "That's exactly what it is." He nodded, filed this confirmation, and returned to his drawing. Inside the Brennan house, the situation had reached the stage that Silas Brennan had not allowed himself to model in advance because modeling it would have required acknowledging its possibility, and acknowledging its possibility would have required him to revisit decisions he had made with full confidence and did not want to revisit. The cast iron stove in the parlor had been burning continuously since the storm's arrival, fed with the meticulous regularity of a man who understands that the moment the fire drops below a critical temperature, recovery becomes exponentially more expensive in fuel and time. He understood this. He was managing it with the competence and attention that 25 years of experience in cold climates produces. He was also losing. The stack effect in a structure as well built as his house should have been manageable. In a normal winter, it was manageable. In a normal winter, the air exchange rate produced by the stove's operation was offset by the structural integrity of the walls and the insulating capacity of the wood, and the net result was an interior temperature that required effort to maintain, but rewarded that effort proportionally. This was not a normal winter. The outdoor temperature had dropped to levels that changed the arithmetic of the exchange. Fundamentally, the incoming cold air was so far below any temperature the stove could process at a sustainable fuel rate that the system had tipped from manageable deficit into accelerating loss. He was burning more than he was gaining. He had been burning more than he was gaining since the second day, and the wood supply, which he had calculated as generous for a hard winter, had revealed itself as calibrated for a hard winter of a different kind than this one. His wife Eleanor had the quality of stillness that people acquire when they have assessed a situation completely and arrived at conclusions they are not ready to share because sharing them would require the people around them to arrive at those conclusions also, and the people around them are not ready. She kept the girls occupied. She rationed the food with a precision she did not comment on. She sat near the stove in the evenings with her mending the way she always sat near the stove in the evenings with her mending, and if the radius within which the mending was warm enough to work in had contracted by roughly half since the previous week, she did not remark on it. On the second evening, she looked up from her work and asked, her voice carrying nothing that would alarm the girls. "Silas, how much dry wood is left?" He told her. The number had the quality of a verdict. She returned to her mending. After a moment, and Clara Holt's children. He did not answer immediately. He opened the stove door, made an adjustment to the arrangement of the burning wood that did not need to be made, and closed it again. The cast iron ticked and popped with the sounds of metal operating near its thermal limits. "I don't know," he said finally, which was the truest thing he had said in several days. Eleanor did not press it. She understood what the answer meant, which was that he had told himself a thing with confidence, and the confidence was becoming a source of weight rather than support. She had lived with Silas Brennan for 26 years, and she knew the specific quality of his silences, which were comfortable and which were the silence of something working through its own collapse. By the morning of the third day, 2 of the wooden chairs from the kitchen had been burned. The temperature inside the house had not been above freezing since midnight. Eleanor had moved the girls into the bedroom and piled on every blanket and piece of heavy clothing in the house, and they slept in a dense, fabric-heavy arrangement that maintained survivable warmth through collective body heat and insulation, rather than through any contribution from the ambient air of the room. The house, Silas Brennan's finest construction, the house he had built as a demonstration of what proper building in this climate looked like, was failing. Not from any defect in its construction, from the fundamental limitation of what it was, a box built to resist the cold, which the cold had decided this particular winter to treat as a challenge worth accepting. He sat in the kitchen in the gray third morning light, wrapped in the bearskin his father had sent from Maine, when he had first told the family he was going to Colorado, and looked at the cold stove. He had let it go out an hour ago because the last of the dry hardwood was gone, and the green pine he had as a reserve burned badly enough that the trade-off between its poor heat output and its heavy creosote production had tipped against lighting it. He was a builder. He understood materials. He understood that green wood in a sealed stove in a cold room was a different kind of problem than no wood, not a solution. He thought about Clara Holt. He had been thinking about her in the intermittent, uncomfortable way that a person thinks about a decision they made with full conviction that is beginning to develop the specific texture of error. Not dramatically, not with the sudden reversal of a man who has seen the light, but with the gradual, resistant acknowledgement of someone whose certainty is being worn down by the accumulation of contrary evidence. He had told her the tunnel would be a damp, frozen tomb by December. It was November 3rd. He was sitting in a damp, freezing house. The arithmetic of this comparison was not lost on him. He dressed in everything he owned that could be worn, simultaneously told Eleanor he was going for help, and went outside. The world had been replaced. That was the only accurate description of what the storm had done to the landscape, not altered it, not covered it, but replaced it with a different world that occupied the same geographic coordinates. The snow was waist deep in the open areas and chest deep in the wind shadow of any structure, and its surface was not the soft, workable surface of ordinary snowfall, but a wind-packed crust that alternated between bearing his weight and giving way without warning, so that each step was a negotiation with uncertain ground. The air temperature was below any calibration he had personal experience with. It operated on his exposed skin with an efficiency that was not painful in the conventional sense, but simply immediate, converting the available warmth in that tissue to cold with the impartial speed of a physical law being applied. He navigated by the shapes of things rather than their surfaces. The dark bulk of the feed barn against the white, the line of the fence posts, each one wearing a cap of packed snow, marching up the hillside in the direction of the Holt property. He followed the fence line because it was the only geometry that remained reliable, the only linear feature in a landscape that had otherwise abolished distinction between ground and sky, near and far, path and field. The fence line ended where the Holt property began, and after that he moved by memory, the memory of a man who had ridden that track enough times to have the distances in his body measured in effort rather than in units. The wind hit him differently in the open, without the fence to register his progress, and there were 2 periods of perhaps 5 minutes each where he was not certain he was still moving in the right direction, where the disorientation of a monochromatic, featureless, white environment was complete enough that he had to stop and think through his last certain position and work forward from it rather than trusting his current perceptions. He found the cabin by its darkness. In a world of unbroken white, the collapsed section of the roof was a dark shape, and dark shapes were information. He pushed toward it, his legs operating on a purely mechanical basis. By then, the decision-making function having been transferred from volition to something more fundamental. The door had been blown partially open, a drift of hard-packed snow filling the interior to window height on the north side. He got through the door and stood in the ruined interior and looked at the empty room, the hook where the lamp had hung, the bare shelf, the cold stove, and understood that she had not been here when the storm hit. She had left deliberately. She had taken the children somewhere. He allowed himself one full breath of something that was not quite hope, but was the physical sensation of a weight being conditionally removed, and then he went back out into the storm. The mouth of the tunnel was 30 yards from the cabin on a line he knew, and he moved toward it on the preserved geometry of that knowledge, rather than on any visual information the landscape was currently providing. He was not walking efficiently by then. He was moving with the committed mechanical forward lean of a man who has reduced the activity to its minimum components. Weight shift, push, recover, repeat, because the cognitive overhead of anything more complex was no longer available to him. His hands had stopped reporting useful information from inside the gloves. His face had stopped hurting, which he understood somewhere in the functioning part of his thinking was not an improvement. He went down without deciding to. His right leg broke through the snow crust into a void beneath a shallow drainage channel he had not seen, and the recovery from that misstep spent the last of whatever reserve had been maintaining his upright posture. He found himself on his hands and knees in the snow, with no immediate plan for returning to vertical. His right glove was pressed flat against the ground, and through the leather and the wool liner and the numbness, he felt something. It was not warmth in any normal sense of the word. It was the absence of a cold that should have been there. The ground beneath his right hand was snow-covered and should have been conducting cold upward with the aggressive efficiency of frozen earth in contact with the atmosphere. It was not. There was something beneath the snow and beneath the ground that was interrupting that conduction. something that was not cold when everything around it was cold. He followed it on his hands and knees. The elk hide at the tunnel entrance moved when he pushed against it, and the air that touched his face on the other side, the first inch of it, the immediately available air, were just past the barrier, had a temperature that his nervous system registered as extraordinary because his nervous system had been calibrated by 3 days of the opposite and was not prepared for a return to ordinary. He went in. The transition was not gradual in the way that transitions in temperature are gradual in normal circumstances where the body adjusts incrementally and the adjustment is experienced as comfort, arriving in stages. After 3 days in a house that had failed to maintain freezing, in an hour of movement through conditions that had pushed his core temperature below its comfortable range, the ambient air of the tunnel at 10 feet in the cool still, carrying none of the lethal edge of the outside air, registered as something his body interpreted as rescue before his mind had processed enough information to form the same conclusion. His legs simply stopped being willing to maintain vertical. He sat against the tunnel wall at 15 feet in and breathed. And the breathing was the first thing he had done in several hours that did not cost him something he did not have to spend. He was aware of the transition continuing around him as he moved inward the lamplight. Before he could see its source, the warmth building in the walls, in the air, the floor under his hands conducting a gentle, steady heat that had no business existing at this depth in this season, according to anything he knew about construction and thermal dynamics. He rounded the slight curve in the tunnel at 35 feet and saw the chamber. Clara was at the table mending. Tom was on the floor on his stomach with his drawings spread in front of him, one hand propped under his chin. Ruth was asleep on her platform bed, her face carrying the absolute peace of a child whose environment has given her no current cause for vigilance. The lamp on the table burned with the steady vertical flame of a lamp in a windless, draft-free space. The stove at the far end of the chamber, her pile of ugly hand-fired brick, her clay mortared maze of internal passages, radiated in the specific directionless way of a mass that has stored heat rather than a surface that is producing it, so that the warmth in the chamber seemed to come from the walls and the floor and the air simultaneously without a single identifiable point of origin. Tom saw him first. He looked up from his drawings at Brennan's appearance in the chamber entrance, his expression cycling through recognition assessment, a child's version of the same complicated calculation that Clara's face was already performing. He stood up not urgently, but with the purposeful steadiness he had been developing for months, and looked at his mother. Clara was already moving. She crossed the chamber and reached him where he had stopped in the entrance, his large frame reduced by the cold and the effort and the days of inadequate heat to something that was still physically imposing but no longer carried its usual weight of authority. His face was raw, the exposed strip of it marked by the white patches of superficial frostbite that she recognized from seeing it on miners who had spent too long in the open in bad weather. His hands, when she took hold of his arm to guide him further into the chamber, were rigid inside the gloves. Tom, without instruction, had already gone to the bedding shelf and was pulling the spare wool blanket from it, not the one Ruth was using, the spare, the one his mother had taught him was the reserve, and had it ready before Brennan had fully registered that there was a chair behind him and that the back of his knees were being guided to it. Clara unwrapped his outer layers methodically, starting with the scarf and working outward, not quickly, but with the purposeful efficiency of someone who has read enough of William Holt's notes to know that rapid rewarming of severely cold tissue does damage that slow rewarming does not. She assessed his hands. The frostbite was superficially, the white patches were at the surface of the skin, not deep, and the tissue still had resilience when she pressed it, which meant the damage was in the reversible category if he was warmed slowly and kept from refreezing. She put his hands between hers, not heating them, just interrupting the cold, and held them. The stove's radiant warmth moved around them, both from the walls, from the floor, from the charged mass of brick and stone that had been quietly doing this work since November 1st. He was looking at the stove. He had been looking at it since he had first seen it, in the way that a person looks at something that is simultaneously familiar in its components and completely alien in its assembly. He was a man who had built more fireplaces and chimneys and heating installations than he could accurately count, and what he was looking at did not correspond to any of them in form or in behavior. It was not hot. It was not making noise. It was not demanding fuel or attention or the constant management that any heating apparatus he had worked with required as the fundamental condition of its operation. It was simply warm in the way that the earth itself is warm, without display, without insistence, as an intrinsic property of what it was, rather than as a performance it was currently giving. He looked at the walls. He looked at the floor. He looked at Ruth's face in sleep, flushed and entirely at ease, with no extra blanket over the single wool one. He looked at Tom, who was standing to the side, with the precise, watchful patience of his father's son, monitoring the situation for any development that required his contribution. When Brennan finally spoke, his voice had the stripped-down quality of a man who has exhausted his available resources and arrived at the bedrock of what he actually is. How? It was not a question with a rising inflection. It was the sound of a word that had to be said because the alternative was silence. And silence in that moment would have been a form of not surviving the thing he had just walked through. Clara looked at the stove. She looked at the warm walls of the tunnel, the patient stone that had been listening since the first fire, storing what it heard, giving it back in the language of steady, directionless warmth. She thought about the words she had not said to him when he stood at the tunnel entrance 6 weeks ago and delivered his verdict and rode away. She thought about the right moment for a thing and how the right moment for a thing is not always when you want to say it, and sometimes the wait between wanting to say it and it being true enough to say produces a version of it that is worth more than the first draft would have been. You built walls to fight the winter, Mr. Brennan. Her voice was quiet, and there was nothing in it addressed to his failure or her vindication, because neither of those things was the point anymore. Your stove shouted, and the wind took every word. I asked the mountain for shelter. My heart spoke to the stone, and the stone remembered. He looked at his hands, which were beginning to register pain, as the superficial tissue thawed, the productive, promising pain of circulation returning, rather than the absent, dangerous pain of tissue that has stopped communicating. He looked at the stove. He looked at Tom, who met his eyes with the direct, undefended gaze of a child who has not yet learned to be diplomatic about the truth. She went to the small side oven built into the stove's lower section, a feature from William Holt's design that she had replicated because the notes had been specific about its utility, and removed the loaf she had put in that morning. The bread was the particular dark gold of a slow oven, and the smell of it had been part of the tunnel's atmosphere for hours, absorbed into the background, the way good smells always absorb into backgrounds, and only become noticeable again when they are disrupted by contrast. She cut a thick slice, the steam rising from the cut face in the warm air. She crossed to Brennan and held it out. You're cold, she said. Eat. He took it as with hands that were beginning to work again, and the solidity of the loaf, its weight, its heat, simple and alive in his palms, undid something in him that the cold had only compressed. Silas Brennan, master builder of Prosperity Gulch, man who had constructed every sound structure for 30 miles in any direction, wept with the specific, unself-conscious release of someone whose certainty has finally cost them enough that the bill has come due all at once. Tom watched this with the thoughtful, contained expression he brought to things he was filing away for later consideration rather than things he was processing in real time. He looked at the stove. He looked at Brennan. He sat back down with his drawings and picked up his pencil, and the sound of it moving across the paper was the sound of the tunnel returning to itself. Brennan slept for 6 hours on the spare bedding, which Clara had installed against the chamber wall without commentary. When he woke, the stove was still warm. It had not been refired since the morning, which meant it had been radiating for the better part of a day on a single firing, performing within the parameters William Holt's notes had projected. Brennan sat up and put his hand against the stone wall beside him and held it there for a long time. He spent 2 days in the tunnel. He did not ask to stay. He asked very little of anything, which was itself a form of communication from a man who had previously expressed himself primarily through the confident provision of answers. He watched. He asked technical questions, not challenging ones, but acquiring ones, the questions of someone who was trying to understand a system well enough to build it, which was the only mode of engagement with new information that his mind had been trained to operate in. She answered each one fully without editorializing because the information was the point and it deserved to be transmitted accurately. On the second day, while she was explaining the geometry of the internal flue passages, in response to a specific question about the angle of the final section, before the granite connection, Tom looked up from his drawings and added without preamble a correction to her description of the transition angle. He was right, she acknowledged it. Brennan looked at the boy. He had turned 8 somewhere in October, a birthday marked with a small cake, and Edmund's old pocket compass, now worn on a cord around his neck, then looked at the drawing spread in front of him. "Can I see those?" Brennan said. Tom considered this for a moment, then gathered the drawings and brought them across the chamber and laid them out on the table. Brennan looked at them for a long time, moving from one to the next with the slow, comprehensive attention he gave to plans. He had been reading construction drawings for 30 years. What he was reading now was the work of a child who had taught himself drafting from the practical necessity of understanding something he needed to understand, and who had in the process produced documents that were structurally legible in ways that formal training was not required to achieve. He looked at Tom for a moment. Tom looked back at him with Edmund Holt's eyes. "You're going to be a builder," Brennan said. Tom's answer was immediate and certain. "I'm going to be a geologist, like my dad." He paused, reconsidering with the rigor he applied to his own statements. "But I'll know how to build things too." Brennan nodded. He straightened the drawings carefully and returned them to their owner. The storm broke on the 4th day of November, the way polar vortex systems break. Not gracefully, not gradually, but with the abruptness of a pressure that has exhausted itself and simply stops. The wind ceased first, then the snow. The sky cleared to the specific hard deep blue of post-storm high altitude, and the sunlight on the snow was so absolute, so concentrated in its reflection, that the world looked briefly like something that had been made rather than something that had happened. Prosperity Gulch assessed itself. 3 cabins on the outskirts had collapsed under snow load. 11 people had serious frostbite, 2 of whom would lose fingers. The community's combined wood supply had been consumed to a level that would have been catastrophic if the storm had run another 2 days, which it had not. But the margin was the kind that rearranges a community's understanding of what constitutes adequate preparation. Nobody had died. The margin on that was also narrower than anyone was comfortable discussing directly. Brennan called the town meeting himself, which was his prerogative as the man who had built the meeting hall, and whose standing in the community derived partly from the fact that when he called for attention, he had generally earned the authority to do so. He stood at the front of the room in the first week of November with his hands showing the early stages of the frostbite recovery that his wife had been managing with the patient competence she brought to everything, and he told the assembled residents of Prosperity Gulch what he had seen. He was a precise man. He described the tunnel and its dimensions. He described the masonry stove and its operating principle in the limited but accurate terms he had absorbed from 2 days of conversation and observation. He described the temperature inside the chamber on the 3rd day of the worst storm in Colorado memory. He described the warm wall of granite at the end, the natural fissure that carried the exhaust to the surface, and the 14 inches of channel that a woman with a hammer and chisel had cut through solid rock over 11 days by lamplight. He did not describe his own condition when he arrived. He did not describe the bread. He did not describe weeping. Those were not parts of the technical account he was providing, and the technical account was what the town needed. One man, Frank Delacroix, who ran the assay operation on the south end of town, and who had survived the storm in a structure that was objectively better insulated than Brennan's house, and had therefore emerged with his confidence in existing methods largely intact, pushed back from the row of chairs where he sat, and said what several others were thinking. One woman's luck in a hole in the ground is not a building standard, Silas. We don't put our families in mines because one miner happened to stay warm. Brennan looked at him without heat. It wasn't luck. I've been building structures for 25 years. What she built is thermodynamically correct. I watched it run for 2 days. The principle is sound, and the execution worked. He paused. Come up and see it. Come put your hand on the wall in the first week of November and tell me what you think afterward. 12 people made the trip over the following 2 weeks. 3 of them were women who had not been consulted about the meeting but had opinions about the outcome of it that they intended to have registered through direct observation rather than secondhand report. Margaret Sutter was among them, and her assessment, delivered to her husband James over dinner, and then more widely through the mechanisms by which women's assessments circulate in small communities, was concise. It works the way she said it would work, and we should have listened to her in September. The building began the following spring. It began with Brennan because Brennan was the builder, and because the act of beginning it was itself a statement that he had decided to make publicly and with his full professional standing behind it. He hired 2 of his regular crew and rode up to the Holt property on a morning in April. The specific weight of that date was not lost on Clara, who registered it and did not mention it with a notebook and a measuring tape, and the demeanor of a man who had apprenticed himself to a new subject and intended to learn it correctly. He spent a week in the tunnel with William Holt's journals, which Clara allowed him to read in their entirety, and with Tom, who had by then developed the journal's contents into a working knowledge that he could articulate and demonstrate rather than merely recite. Brennan's notebook filled. He asked questions that were increasingly sophisticated as the week progressed and his underlying understanding of the principles deepened, and Clara answered them from experience rather than from theory because she now had both and knew the difference. The first new structure built on Brennan's modified design went up that summer on the hillside half a mile east of the Holt property for a family named Pruitt, who had arrived from Kansas the previous year with 5 children and a constitutional optimism about their cabin that the preceding winter had significantly revised. Brennan designed it with a partially earth-bermed back wall and a central masonry hearth that he called in his notes a Holt hearth, which became the name the town used without formal adoption or discussion, the way names settle into use in communities that have decided something together without quite knowing when the deciding happened. The first time he showed his design drawings to a group of prospective clients at the meeting hall, Tom was there. Claire had not brought him specifically. He had asked to come, and she had said yes because his reasons for wanting to be there were his own and were good ones. He sat in the back row and listened and did not speak, and at the end of the session, when one of the prospective clients asked a technical question about the mortar composition for the firebox, lining the specific mix for high-temperature performance at the firebox versus the lower temperature passages further along the flue system, and Brennan paused to check his notes. Tom's voice came from the back of the room with the same unhurried certainty it had carried in the tunnel. The room turned to look at an 8-year-old. Tom did not modify his posture or his expression in response to being looked at. He was his father's child in this, as in other things. The attention of others was information he noted rather than a condition he performed for. He repeated the specification from William Holt's journal with the accuracy that comes from having read something important enough times that it has become part of the texture of thought rather than a fact stored for retrieval. 3 parts clay to 1 part yarn to 1 part short straw. Firing temperature no higher than orange. Brennan wrote it down. He did not comment on the source. The room moved on. The Holt hearth spread through Prosperity Gulch over the following 3 years with the organic efficiency of solutions that actually solve the problem they are aimed at, which is a different and more reliable mechanism of adoption than fashion or mandate. Each new structure built on Brennan's design was slightly better than the previous one, incorporating adjustments from the performance data of the earlier ones and from the continuing conversation between Brennan's construction expertise and the principles in William Holt's journals. The community did not become a community of tunnel dwellers Most of the new structures were surface buildings, some partially burned, some freestanding, all built with masonry, thermal mass at their center, and the stack effect physics of cast iron abandoned as a primary heating strategy. Clara was not consulted in any official capacity. She was asked informally and repeatedly, and she answered informally and accurately, and the answers traveled through the community in the way that useful information travels, attached to the people who had received it and willing to be transferred to the people who needed it. She continued living on the property Edmund had left her in the cabin. She rebuilt the summer after the storm, with Brennan's crew providing the labor and his modified design providing the engineering, a structure with stone walls 18 inches thick and a Holt hearth at its center that she had built herself, with Tom managing the mortar mix and Ruth handling the component delivery with an organizational efficiency that has surprised even Brennan. The mountain was still there. The tunnel was still there, its entrance now maintained and cleared rather than overgrown, a space that the community had quietly come to treat as something between a historical site and a proof of concept, the place where the argument had been made and settled in the most decisive possible terms. Clara kept a lamp bracket inside the entrance. The lamp was not always lit, but the bracket was there, which meant the light was available. Years accumulated the way they do, not evenly, not always gently, but with the continuous forward motion that is the only direction available to time. Edmund Holt did not return from the East Ridge in April of 1884, and this fact did not change, and Clara did not expect it to change, and the specific shape of that absence became over the years something that she carried with the practiced balance of someone who has learned to account for a weight that is not going away. It was part of her, which meant it was part of everything she built and everything she taught, including the children who grew into themselves in a house that was warm in November because their mother had read a dead man's journals and believed what they said. Tom left for Denver at 18 to study geology, which surprised no one who had paid attention. He came back to Prosperity Gulch at 23, worked for 2 summers on a regional geological survey, and built a house for himself on the eastern edge of the property with walls of local stone and a hearth that he designed himself from first principles. The design checked against William Holt's journals and found to be independently congruent with them in every significant particular. He had arrived at the same place his great-grandfather had arrived at through a different path, which suggested that the place was real and not merely inherited. Ruth went east for schooling, returned west for her own reasons, and settled in a town 2 days' ride from Prosperity Gulch, where she eventually ran a general mercantile known, among other things, for stocking the specific grade of fire clay that the Holt hearth design required. She maintained that this was entirely coincidental. Nobody who knew her believed it. The last entry in William Holt's worn leather journal, the one that Clara had read by lamp oil on the night she burned the mining company's letter, had been placed there by Edmund. She had found it on a second reading, written in pencil on the inside back cover, in the leftward-leaning hand that she had spent years holding at a slight angle to read, "Stone does not shout. It does not need to. It has been saying the same thing since before anyone was listening, and it will still be saying it long after the last fire has gone cold. The patient thing outlasts the urgent thing. This is not a philosophy. This is physics." He had not dated it. She did not know when he had written it. She did not know if he had written it before or after he stood in the tunnel at 60 feet and put his hand against the warm granite and felt what she had felt on the morning she burned the contract and decided. It did not matter. The understanding was the understanding whenever it arrived, and it was true in the same way that the warmth of the stone was true, not because someone had declared it, but because the physics had always been the physics, waiting with complete indifference for someone to stop arguing with it long enough to build something. Many years after, when the tunnel had become what communities make of the places where important things happen, a site of informal pilgrimage, a destination for the explanatory walk that older residents offered to newer ones, a place where the evidence of a particular kind of thinking was still physically present in the stone, A visitor would sometimes ask about the small letters cut into the rock face near the old stove low on the wall, at the height a child sitting on the floor would naturally reach. The letters were rough cut with something small, the point of a chisel perhaps, or a nail driven by a hand that was not yet full-sized. They had been there since the winter of 1884, and the tunnel's stable temperature had preserved them as cleanly as the day they were made. Stone remembers. TH aged 1885. The stone did. It always had. It was doing it still.